going to take a look at one more example, which we're going to use to look at the economic example for human economy of capital intensity. So here you see a chart of 3 different kinds of phytoplankton. These are the primary producers, the little critters in the ocean that use the energy from the sun to basically become food for more complex creatures. So this is the, these are like the nuts and berries and the food and the basic agriculture of the oceans. So again, in the Paleozoic, the main producers, the only producers, included a large number of prokaryotes, cyanobacteria, and very, very small eukaryotes. The main elements that they used, in addition to the basic organics of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and so forth, they used iron, zinc, and copper. By the time of the second phase you see here, the dinoflagellates and coccolithophores, for one thing, the number of elements being used has changed. Manganese, cobalt, and cadmium are starting to be used, meaning that higher organisms in the food web that eat them now have a greater variety of elements to work with in the possible structures that could exist in their bodies. And then in the third stage, in the Cenozoic, we see a real takeoff of diatoms. Diatoms now have included silicon into their bodies. They arose at the same time as the grasses on land, which were the first land plants to use silicon as well. So when they, but based on moving silicon around and getting more of it into rivers, that increased the availability of soluble silicon for diatoms to use. Now, there's definitely an increase in the productivity or the energy of these primary producers, which we can see mirrored in, we're going to come to human agriculture in a second. One more factor that we're going to look at is per primary producer, per species of phytoplankton, how many species higher on the food web could they support? In land terms, you would say how many animals are there per species of plants, is a rough analogy. So back in the Paleozoic, there were about 5 species of higher organisms per species of phytoplankton. In the Mesozoic, in the second stage, it was about 10. And in the Cenozoic, with the advent of the diatoms, it's now 60. Now there's 2 ways of looking at this. These primary producers themselves did become more efficient. Diatoms had storage vacuoles, for example, which let them go through tough times and reproduce several times without being able to create their own energy. They were able to store it. But it also shows that the biosphere is increasingly shifting in terms of its emphasis or its capital intensity to the higher parts of the food web. Let's take a look at human agriculture. Around the time of Lincoln, half of the United States population, half of the workforce, worked in agriculture. Half of the workforce. A decade after World War II, it was only about 10%. And today, it's only about 2 to 3% of the population is directly employed in agriculture. Now, nonetheless, between the time of Lincoln and this decade after World War II, the amount of food produced per acre increased dramatically. The use of mechanical farm equipment, the use of fertilizers, the increased use of irrigation, electricity for water pumps, the Tennessee Valley Authority. The land was made much more productive, and that's an improvement. However, the main focus of the economy was in more highly capital-intensive branches. Agriculture became less predominant as the main occupation of the economy. As a species, we were becoming more self-determined. An increasing quantity of the work, an increasing ratio of the work that we did to maintain ourselves was work that was done on our own account, on things that we had made, and was relatively less dependent on the biosphere per se. We were becoming more self-determined. So this brings up a point that you've made in your economics textbook, Mr. LaRouche, which is that as economy develops, an increasing ratio of the economic production will be in more capital-intense modes of production. The relative importance of agriculture and forestry and mining decreases, and the percentage of the population involved in making capital goods, as opposed to things for direct consumption, will tend to increase. These examples from the biosphere show how increasingly more complex organisms are where the increase in diversity is predominantly seen in the biosphere, as opposed to within the primary producers. So the difference, though, is that human society, in a different way than the biosphere, can go backwards. We're able to go backwards. With these changes in the biosphere, with the mass extinctions that we've seen, you know, our research has indicated that instead of looking at a mass killing off, one must also focus on the fact that there's a higher type of life that's supplanting and replacing the earlier one, which may indeed be part of why it dies off. However, if you take the human example of the collapse of the Roman Empire, here you see a system, you know, you see something like a mass extinction in the development of life, but without something higher taking it over immediately. Rome was not, per se, supplanted by something higher. I mean, really, until we had the creation of the American Republic, that was like a real ability to fight against empire and win that fight. So I just want to share some of the figures about this. That take Greece, for example. Greece reached a high point in around 400 BC, where population estimates, were that about 25 Greeks live per square kilometer of their land. Now that wasn't equaled. That level of population density wasn't reached until, for example, in Rome, at the time of the beginning of the Common Era, at the time of Christ, 5 people lived per square kilometer in the Roman territories, compared to Greece's 25 several centuries before that. This Greek population density wasn't reached in other parts of Europe until 1200 for Italy and around 1400 in England. It took almost 2 millennia for England to reach the population density that had been achieved in Greece around 400 BC. You know, the Roman Empire represented a backwards trend technologically. They didn't implement and use new technologies. Maybe, plumbing and aqueducts. But they didn't make extensive use of water wheels, for example, which they knew of, but were not using as a higher form of power. They rejected it, like today's rejection of nuclear power. Although they did know something about the creation of artificial fertilizers, it wasn't used in large degree. And the use of draft animals, you know, oxen have very thick necks. And you can make a very simple collar to go around the neck of oxen, and they can, you know, pull a plow or whatnot. Horses are much better draft animals, but because of the way their neck is formed, if you just put a rope around the neck of a horse and have it try to plow something, it's going to choke. You're going to block its windpipe. So the Romans, instead of developing horse collars that prevented the horse from choking, which were eventually developed in the 9th century, instead of doing that, the Romans just made their fields short enough, each furrow short enough, that the horse could plow it before it started to asphyxiate and pass out. And they'd give the horse a break, and then they'd, you know, plow another furrow. Yeah, real lack of advancement here. So, and then if you take the citizenry of Rome, because the economy overall was unproductive, the people actually had negative economic value. There was nothing to be done with them, no work for them. An increasing number of holidays entertained them. By the time in the 2nd century BC, there were around 96 holiday days in Rome. By the year 50 AD, I can't tell if I wrote 157 or 159, there were that many holidays per year, with all sorts of entertainment provided at the circus, you know, people killing each other, animals killing people killing animals, blood everywhere, prostitutes at the ready, just a really disgusting environment. And you think about what's the conception of human beings in this system. You can see why this led to a collapse that took literally centuries to overcome. Many of these regions, it wasn't until maybe the 6th or 7th century AD that they regained the population that they had during the time of, let's say, around the time of Christ. So, you know, the Circus Maximus was eventually enlarged to have over 250,000 spectators could fit into it. This is huge. So overall, you got the similar potential for us today, where we are turning our backs on the needed characteristic of our species that makes us a super species, our ability to develop new technological breakthroughs and then apply them to change the number of people that we can support. If we turn our back on that, and instead insulate our windows, say we don't need fusion, shut down our nuclear power plants, and build windmills, which I've got news for you. They were a big development maybe 1,000 years ago, but they're not a development today. If we do that, we're going to see the exact same thing, except on a global and worse scale, that we can see in the historical record. The principle of empire is something that just has to be removed. For most of mankind's history in the past several millennia, most of the people have been controlled by the principle of empire. And even the small breaks in between that have created all of the tremendous growth that we've seen to have the society that we're able to have today, much of it came in small bursts in between periods of imperial domination. So if you envision what can a world be if we reject this imperial view of ourselves, our fellow human beings, as sense-driven pleasure seekers, throw off this old idea of monetarism as a standard of value, and recognize and develop a concept of economics as based on our ability to transform our relationship to nature by the development of scientific breakthroughs, and that's what the people around us, that's their value. That's the value of that new child that was born who might become a genius. Then we can go in a completely different direction. But if we don't, as the case of Rome illustrates, as Mr. LaRouche has been warning, we have the potential for a much worse Dark Age condition now, and we're leading government decisions being made right now are pushing us in that direction. So we've got a pretty short window of opportunity available right now to change that direction, and that's a job that we have to take up.
And then the other part about this is, the other side of this at the same time, mankind is the only noetic species. Now, noetic has two meanings. One is biological, and it's social in the sense of being biological social. There's also the voluntary kind of creativity, where leaps are made. And the leaps are made by human beings who are raised in a climate which is not a climate of slaves. So most of mankind has lived in a slave society or something similar to a slave society. And the majority of the people are allowed to live if they remain stupid. And we've had a lot of success in creating stupid people on this basis. So the point, Cousé's conception was not some random idea, but the point was that he understood the problems of Europe. Here you had this great Renaissance. It was one of the greatest upsurges of mankind that ever existed. And in the midst of that, there again came the repression, the destruction of that process, which he saw in his lifetime. And this was a fairly short period between the high point of the Renaissance and what followed. So you had the tumult around the people who were influenced by Cousé and related people, a whole related group of people. And you found in two things happened. The influence of Cousé, in particular on his friends who went across the oceans, unleashed something where they were able to influence the area across the oceans in a way which was not really possible for the general populations of, for example, Europe and Africa and so forth. And it worked. This was the great conflict, though. At the same time, we did free ourselves from what was coming on as the anti-Renaissance in Europe. Real bestiality. And so that the fertility of the development across the Atlantic Ocean, especially into the Americas as such, created a revolutionary movement. Now, this fed back on Europe. Now, Europe is faced with the areas across the Atlantic and so forth. So, therefore, they are now they have to progress. And if you look at the history of mankind over this period, you see the great collapse of the preceding century. Then you see the century of evolution upward, which includes Cousé. Then you see a sudden precipitation into religious warfare, which is a means of destruction of what there is in European civilization, and the resistance is against what we call progress. And so progress was stupefied. Science kept become more stupefied. You had people who were in that century, Cusa's century, and the following century, you had a number of remarkable people. The ratio of remarkable people diminished in the next century. And in a sense, therefore, you had a unique thing. Leibniz was unique in that sense that he represented that new century and was the leader of it. And the great tumult occurred. You know, like the people were waiting for the death of Leibniz to start the British system. Mm-hmm. And they were just getting these messages back and forth. Is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? They didn't dare do what they wanted to do until they were sure that he was dead. And then you had another Renaissance, which was the French Renaissance, which actually got gobbled up in the process of the French Revolution. But it was also the French society was also a degenerating society. You compare the leading figures who entered that 17th century, as opposed to the 18th century, and you see a general degeneration. But you also see an impetus forward. Now, this all goes together with the issue of what is creativity, human creativity. You cannot compare human creativity, human behavior in general, with animal behavior. It has none of the characteristics of animal behavior. It does in a certain lower sense, but the point is, what's the difference? The difference is the noetic powers of mankind are unique. No animal has voluntary creative powers. They have innovation, but creativity and innovation are not the same thing. So what's happened now, in the meantime, you have the oligarchical system, which comes a continuity from the Roman Empire into the British Empire. There is no real break. The British Empire today is a direct continuation, politically, socially, of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire hates what happened in going across the oceans. And their job was to try to crush everything that tried to imitate what was being done across the oceans. As we saw in the experience of the United States. We succeeded, but these bastards kept coming in with their intent to crush everything. Mm-hmm. So in this process, we have lost, because we try to interpret things as the people are all the same, they're different, but they're all the same, they have the same tendencies, the same behavioral tendencies. Well, they don't. Creative people do not have the inherent tendencies of non-creative people. They don't. And therefore, when you're talking about species, you cannot make a leap from animal species of all kinds to mankind, because mankind is a noetic, that is voluntarily creative. It voluntarily creates its higher states of organization. And no other species does that, or can do it. So what you have is you say, well, people are like animals. Well, some people are like animals. Why? Because they're denied the expression of human creativity. And that's what bestiality is. So this is the real issue that has to be treated.